Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom and your first flip of the second quarter, right? We're going now right into the second quarter, even though it's kind of a weird quarter, right? It's kind of a little bit of a weird situation. Not a weird quarter. It's going to be a great quarter. Y'all have Boo Boo and Pink Week and like all this other crazy great stuff to really look forward to that I'm really excited to see y'all really enjoy. The thing about it, though, is it's kind of weird content-wise because we already talked a little bit about the Middle Ages in the last quarter, and now we're going to be bringing it up again in this quarter, right? So the thing about it is, though, is you should be looking at this as, like, use that to your advantage, right? You've already seen a bunch of these test questions already. You've already seen a bunch of this stuff already, so it's going to make it even easier on you, okay? So looking into it, though, right, we left off talking about in class today the medieval Catholic Church. Also, shout out B period and C period. Really great couple of classes today. Did really well, but B period got a little bit further ahead, right? Got a little tiny bit further ahead than C period did, because C period we were welcoming a new student, we were doing a bunch of review and stuff like that, and we kind of just like lost track of time for about like 2 seconds, right? The thing about it, though, getting into it, we did do a lot of really big stuff in all of our classes today. F period, you're going to be doing this today as well, where we made like a list of important dates going forward, other things that are going to be going down when it comes to school and stuff like that. So let's make sure that we're staying on top of everything, even though we're going to have some random breaks in here, and then like Boo Boo, and then Pink Week, and then all that other stuff, right? So getting into it, though, we're getting at the medieval Catholic Church. And what we mean by the medieval Catholic Church, of course, I'm talking about the church during the Middle Ages, right? Now, we talked about this stuff in B period already, and we got a little bit further than everybody else. But the thing about it is that there are some similarities between the current Catholic Church and the medieval Catholic Church. Well, really quickly, too, disclaimer before we go any further. The medieval Catholic Church is not the current Catholic Church, okay? So because I'm bringing this up, there was a lot of things that we would today in the modern era look upon the medieval Catholic Church and be like, man, that's not very Catholic, right? The thing about it, though, is you need to understand that at no point or time during this flip am I saying that the medieval Catholic Church is anything like the current one. The current one, which is led by Pope Francis, of course, and is going to be a very large beacon of hope and stuff like that for people, is going to be a good thing. The medieval Catholic Church was growing up in a time where only 4% of the population could read or write, and they had some moments where they could have made better decisions, right? So the thing we will talk about, though, is we're going to talk about what we already know, right? So there's a lot of stuff about the medieval Catholic Church you'll already know because it does reflect the structure of the current Catholic Church. Not the methodology, not the ideas, not the virtues, but the structure of the Catholic Church in the modern day. For example, who led the Catholic Church during the medieval era? Well, it was none other than the Pope, right? The Pope is going to be the same guy that leads the Catholic Church during its original incarnation and then also now. So this is a tradition that has been kept. Even though actually, interestingly enough, in like the 1400s, they almost got rid of the Pope for like a little bit. But there was this big thing called the conciliar movement and stuff like that. But we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later on. But the Pope is going to be a very important office. The first Pope being that of St. Peter and the current Pope being that of Pope Francis. We'll talk about a lot of different popes as well, not during this flip, but going forward. We'll talk about Leo X, which is going to be a really big one that you're going to definitely need to remember. We'll talk about a couple of other like big popes, including like Urban VIII, which was one during the Scientific Revolution. But all you need to know is that the Pope is very important. But also another big thing about the Pope is you got to understand is that he's not the only one leading the church, right? I know I said that very fast. But there is a lot of church hierarchy out there, right? There's a lot of church hierarchy and people underneath the Pope that do help and efficiently lead the Catholic Church as well. And this is the same during the medieval era. And that includes like cardinals and bishops and priests and stuff like that, right? Like I've got to give like Sophia Tran like a little shout out. She did say priest. I had it in here and stuff like that. Shout out Sophia, you were right. And then also though, speaking of this whole thing, popes, bishops, cardinals, priests, all these people, right? They are also going to lean into a very big idea about the Catholic Church that is going to be commonly used today as well. And they're going to commonly use certain figures and icons and tell their stories that are going to be of heavy use in the Catholic faith. And many popes, many cardinals, many bishops are going to become these things. And those icons I'm talking about are saints, right? Why am I bringing up saints right now? Why am I talking about this? Just because in the medieval Catholic era, the stories of saints and their exploits are going to be just as important as it is in the modern era era Catholic Church, right? To give you a little heads up, this relates to y'all's, what's it called? Y'all's confirmation, right? When y'all like picked a saint and stuff like that. And then also there's a patron saint for just about everything. For example, one of the most famous saints, of course, being St. Patrick, right? Who St. Patrick's Day is named after. St. Patrick was, of course, in charge with running all the snakes out of Ireland, which the snakes weren't snakes, it was paganism, and he basically was going there to convert them. Also, another little famous thing about St. Patrick, he used the clover, the three-leaf clover, to actually teach the Holy Trinity to the barbarian Celts that lived in Scotland and Ireland, right? Because he would be like the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, but one plant, right? So that's a very, very interesting little thing about saints, right? They were used heavily in the medieval Catholic era, just like they were today. So also going into it as well, how often did people go to church during the Middle Ages? Now this is where things start to get a little bit different. During the Middle Ages, people went every single day, right? They went every day, 2 to 3 times a day sometimes as well. Mostly for, what is the word y'all use? Reconciliation. There you go. Yeah, mostly for reconciliation. That's confession, right? That's confession. All right, so like now, mostly they went for that. They also went to small services and stuff like that, and then went for large Sunday services as well, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that it looks like people during the Middle Ages went to church a heck of a lot more often than a lot of modern-day Catholics do, right? Or a lot of modern-day Christians, period, right? I was raised Protestant, and like basically everybody did Wednesday and Sunday, and like those were the big nights. So, another big thing to understand, though, as well, is that the Bible was only written in one language, right? Now, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, well, why did they do that? Then some of you are probably thinking, well, only 4% of people could read and write in the first place. That is a very, very important construct to understand. But it is important for the rest of your existence going into this unit, the next unit, and the one after that you understand then the fact that the Bible was only written in Latin is very, very important because it's going to really kind of have some very big political kind of motivations. It's going to have a lot of big kind of crazy stuff happen about it. You're going to see the Protestant Reformation pop up and create people like I was raised by and stuff like that that are going to actually relate a lot to this only being written in Latin thing. Now, why was it written in Latin? Well, remember, it started out as the Roman Catholic Church, right? The Roman Catholic Church. So make sure that we understand that in general, right? So going into it, though, as well, with it only being written in Latin and only certain people knowing how to read or write it or whatever, which is going to set up some other little kind of dicey situations a little bit later on, we also need to understand, though, how did the Catholic Church affect people on an everyday level, right? So the thing is we're going to start very small with the medieval Catholic Church, and then we're going to get very, very large with the medieval Catholic Church on the next end, right? So the whole thing about Catholic faith during the medieval era, while Christianity is spreading very, very quickly, and when we talk about Christianity, we're mainly talking about Catholic Christianity, it's spreading very, very fast. A lot of it revolves around the village church, right? This is a picture of the manor system that we looked up earlier. That right there being the manor system, and of course the manor up here, them chopping up and using the land efficiently, right? Like shout out Kaylee Dublin. Now the big thing about it though as well is that like one of our students today noticed that there was a church on top of every single one of these feasts and stuff like that. Well, the thing about it is your village church was pretty much the nexus and the fulcrum pivot point of the entirety of village life around these middle-aged villages, right? When you lived in, like during the Middle Ages, if you were just a serf, you lived on a village. And on that village, you had a church. And it was ran by a parish priest, okay? Somebody that was actually officially involved with the Catholic Church, somebody that was probably from somewhere nearby where you lived, and your parish priest would serve Mass, reconciliation, and all of the above. Speaking of Mass as well, that Mass that you went to every single day was actually in Latin as well, right? So that actually most people didn't even understand what was being said at Mass. But the parish priest would stand up front, and interestingly enough, the parish priest would not stand like this when he served Mass in the Middle Ages. He actually had his back turned to the crowd, and he actually turned towards the tabernacle. So, like, getting into it, though, it's massively important that we understand that the village church and its role in the lives of middle-aged Catholics, right? So, like, in the medieval era, the biggest thing about the village church is it's where you went to receive your sacraments, right? Now, I know y'all know more about the sacraments than I do, due to the fact that y'all have been taught the sacraments, like, since a very, very young age. I think there's 7. I think there is. I'm not positive. But a big thing that's going to happen tomorrow is you're going to come in and you're going to teach me a little bit too, right? So the thing I know about sacraments, though, especially in relation to the medieval Catholic Church, is that village church provided you with the important sacraments that the Catholics believed that you need so you could go off and be saved or have salvation, right? So the big thing about it is those include baptism, marriage. Oh my God, get over there. All right, so baptism, marriage, burial, confession, or reconciliation, and all of the other things in general, right? But one of the biggest sacraments that you received at your village church regularly was the host, right? The host, of course, being being the Eucharist. Now, when this communion would happen in a village church, a big thing that the medieval Catholic Church taught then and still teaches today is this concept called transubstantiation, right? So transubstantiation is a very different idea from these sacraments up here. I mean, like, anybody can get married, anybody can be baptized, of course, as long as they accept Christ. And, like, of course, anybody can be buried as long as they're, like, an ardent Catholic. And anybody can go to confession as long as you're a Catholic. Now, the interesting thing about it, though, in general, is what I'm getting at with this transubstantiation concept is it relates to one particular sacrament in general, the sacrament of the host, right? The host, what it's getting at is they believed and still believe, okay, that actually when the priest blesses the bread and the wine, when it's taken into your body, it turns into a physical piece of Christ's blood and body, right? So this concept of transubstantiation and the teaching of it is very, very important when it comes to the medieval Catholic Church, okay? So just know that transubstantiation means that transformation of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ, okay? Just keep that in the back of your mind. Now, another big thing about it, though, as well, is this idea of the village church collecting a tax, right? And that tax is known as the tithe. Do me a big favor. Highlight tithe. Circle tithe. Make it look like tithe is exploding. Like, put underlines under it 100 times. The tithe is very important. What the tithe was is every single Sunday, you would go in for your service and you would pay 10% of your weekly income to the village church, right? And you would give it to your parish priest. It would go in this thing called a coffer, which is like a large box with a lock on it. And you literally paid this like tax to the church during the medieval era, right? So the thing about it, though, is that's going to make the medieval Catholic Church enough money to operate, survive, and live. It helps pay the priest and a lot of other things. But over time, as trade returns to the Middle Ages, or trade returns to Western Europe, that tithe is going to keep going up and up and up. So the Catholic Church is going to end up making a lot of money. And we'll talk about what they end up doing with that money a little bit later on. But that tithe is crazy important to understanding anything later, okay? They also, though, would even deal out justice. Now, this is a very interesting little thing. The serfs did not go to courts with lawyers, right? This is a very, very hard thing to look up and a very, very hard thing to understand when you're talking about the Middle Ages. But they didn't have, like, courts or juries or governing bodies like that. They had kingdoms and nobles and things of the like, right? So the closest thing that you had to law and order in the medieval era, since you didn't live in the Byzantine Empire that had Justinian's code and civil law, you would go typically to your noble, who would then refer you to the church. And the village priest operated a lot mostly like a judge and jury, right? They would even deal out justice in the form of things like ordeals, right? Ordeals were these weird things that sometimes priests would do during the Middle Ages, and this is not something that the modern-day Catholic Church does, where, like, for example, they would be like, oh, if you can hold this red-hot piece of metal and it not burn your hand, then that means that you are going to be able to, or like that means that you didn't commit this sin, right? Another ordeal that they would do as well is they would do ones for like, oh, if we're going to tie a rock to your foot and we're going to throw you in a river, and if you sink, then you are guilty, and if you float, then you are innocent or something like that. It was very, very weird, right? I'll look up a couple other ones and we'll talk about them in class, but they also honestly operated a lot like a court, right? And they also would hold celebrations. The village church would hold every single Easter service and all the other really, really big stuff as well throughout the entire holiday schedule, right? And holiday, speaking of, literally represents the word holy day. It's supposed to be representing or going back to the medieval Catholic era, talking about the holiest days of the year and days of not actually working or days of rest, right? Now, getting into it though as well, so we got village churches, but now we got to talk about the big boy churches, the really big ones, right? So we just talked or spent that time talking about the village church and its impact on the regular everyday person in the Middle Ages, right? The serfs, the vassals, the nobles that lived out in that area. But what about the cities, right? There were really, really, really large cities in the medieval era, like Paris, like Rome, like London, like all these other very large, Berlin, all these huge cities in all these different parts of Europe that were being like cropped up and also being built up during the High Middle Ages. What about their church? Did they have like a tiny little village church as well? Of course not. They had these massive things known as cathedrals, right? Cathedrals that were massively huge and were ran and operated by a bishop. So the thing about it is, you've seen cathedrals in your life. St. Louis Cathedral. You've probably seen this cathedral, which is the most famous of all cathedrals. That is the Cathedral of Notre Dame, right? Like now, some of you are like, you mean Notre Dame? No, that's what Americans call the university. This is Notre Dame, the Gothic cathedral. Speaking of Gothic, that's a big thing that you need to understand about the High Middle Ages, is that they developed these cathedrals and built them in a very certain architectural style. And that architectural style is known as Gothic architecture. Do me a favor, write that down right now. Gothic architecture. G-O-T-H-I-C architecture. Gothic architecture. Now, we are going to need to be able to talk about a couple of different elements of Gothic architecture so you can be able to identify a Gothic building or a Gothic thing whenever you do see one, okay? So let's go ahead and dive head first into that. So Gothic architecture is defined, just like zooming back in on Notre Dame right here, by a lot of different ideas, but mainly 4 key particular principles, right? First and foremost, write this down, everything comes to a point. Even their archways, right? Everything on Gothic architecture is supposed to come to a point to actually symbolize and resemble the pointed archways that actually exist in Gothic architecture. So this archway right here, you'll notice, isn't like a perfect little semicircle. It has a pointed vault to it right there, right? So the big thing about that everything coming to a point is it encouraged the creation of spires and things like that as well. And everything comes to a very sharp angle. Another big thing you're going to notice really, really quickly about Gothic architecture, that's me and my wife in front of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, Austria, when we actually went and visited there, and I don't know what to do with my face, as we can all see, so let's just go ahead and do like this. All right, so now the big thing about it, though, is St. Stephen's Cathedral has a very, very good image of Gothic architecture as well. As you can see, everything continually coming to a point. Except this guy. Some of you are probably like, what about that green thing, Mr. Terry? Interesting little thing. They started building this second tower during the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance happened, and then they capped it off. And Renaissance architecture has smooth lines, right? So you can actually see a difference in the architectural styles of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, right? So the big thing about it, though, as well, another huge thing you need to know about Gothic architecture is stained glass windows, right? Stained glass windows. Write that down. Stained glass windows. Stained glass windows became very, very big and very popular in Gothic architecture, and they were heavily used and patroned by rich families, and they gave massive amounts of light and color to the inside of the church as well. Now, looking at stained glass windows as well, something you need to understand is that there would be very large windows known as, let's bounce back one, these ones right here. Next to stained glass windows on the list that you're making, but this, rose windows. Rose windows are these really, really big stained glass, round, circular windows that were very common in Gothic architecture as well. So going into it as well, though, you can see as well, this is another angle of St. Stephen's Cathedral. Everything is coming to a point and everything is very, very aggressive. It's also made out of one type of stone, which is a big thing as well. And then, of course, this is another image of it as well. The cool thing about St. Stephen's Cathedral is that we actually believe that this was originally a gate for the Roman Empire, which is really, really cool. So going into it, though, as well, another thing you're going to notice about Gothic architecture is these big, high, vaulted ceilings. Write that down. Vaulted ceilings. V-A-U-L-T-E-D. So huge ceilings that go very, very far up to the top of the church that provide really good acoustics and very, very large open spaces on the inside of the church. This is the interior of that St. Stephen's Cathedral that I went to when I was in Austria with my wife. And another big one that you're going to see right here is a very famous little critter that they hang on the outside of Gothic cathedrals. These guys are known as gargoyles, right? Gargoyles are spelled G-A-R-G-O-Y-L-E-S. Now, there's one more thing that's crazy important about Gothic architecture that you need to make sure you write down and you need to make sure you know. And it's these guys that are hanging off the edge of the Gothic cathedral right there, okay? You see these weird little rafters that are hung up on the exterior of the church on the outside? Those things have a very important name, and they're the only reason why Gothic architecture can work, and they can make them so large and have the interior ceilings have no rafters in the inside of them. And what they are these things. They're called flying, F-L-Y-I-N-G, and then the second word is buttresses, B-U-T-T-R-E-S-S-E-S, flying buttresses, and they literally buttressed the roof up so it wouldn't actually fall. But these things become very important to the creation of Gothic architecture. They're very, very pretty, very gorgeous, very, very cool, and I like them a lot. So that is Gothic architecture in a nutshell, and we're going to skip over that stuff real quick because we're going to bring it up a little bit later. But really quickly, though, speaking of those cathedrals and speaking of that Gothic architecture and speaking of all this stuff, if these cathedrals are these massive, these absolutely huge churches that are ran by bishops and priests, you think that they're probably going to start attracting people, right? Attracting other priests that want to come there and study and learn and things like that. Well, these cathedrals are going to become areas of learning. And it's going to lead to the growth of these things known as monasteries and convents, okay? That's another really big thing about the Catholic Church, right? So monasteries and convents, what they are large church sanctuaries where monks and nuns could dedicate their life to faith and study, right? So outside of Notre Dame, there was another very famous cathedral that actually eventually turned into the University of Paris, right? So we'll get into this whole university structure thing here in about 2 seconds, but these large church sanctuaries were where monks and nuns went to dedicate their life to faith and study. They would read, they would study, they would translate Latin texts. They would do a lot of very, very important work when it comes to Middle Ages society. Some of the biggest things they did as well is they provided some health care, housing, and they even helped local communities and travelers. So for example, if you were someone traveling through the countryside trying to get from one city to another and you needed some place to stay, you could go stay at a monastery or a convent, and they would help you. The monks and nuns also led a very daily, rigid life set up by this thing right here, okay? The Saint Benedictine rules, okay? So speaking of famous saints and speaking of those 10,000 saints that the Catholic Church uses all the time, you've got one very important one, a guy by the name of Saint Benedict, right? Saint Benedict is going to be this person who creates this thing called the Benedictine rule, and he's going to create it around the 6th century to govern monastic life, okay? So what you'll notice is these monasteries and convents that have all these monks and nuns that live in them that are, of course, dressed like this during the Middle Ages with their robes and a little bald spot on the top of their head, which nobody knows for sure where that comes from. The big thing about it, though, in general, is the Benedictine rules were sets of rules that were given to these monks and nuns so they could live a holy, devout life of study, right? So the big thing about it, though, in general, is that the Saint Benedictine rules were all based around vows of work, vows of silence, vows of labor, and also 3 would be added a little bit later on. Closer to the 11 or 1200s, they added 3 very important rules to the Benedictine rules. And they include poverty, which means that these monks and nuns were not out there to make money. They were out there to help their community. Chastity, which means that they were not a part of the physical relationship of society, that they remained chaste and that they actually remained inside their monasteries and convents to dedicate their life to the Lord and to study. And then also obedience, which is obedience to the Pope and any other church leaders, right? The big thing about it, though, is that these monasteries are then going to later on house the very first large libraries that have been seen during the Middle Ages since the fall of Rome, and they're going to grow into what you know now as universities, right? Universities began to attract guild masters and stuff like that, and they turned into centers of learning. Now, interestingly enough, though, this idea of universities was actually borrowed from the Muslims in southern Spain, because as you can see right here, the Islamic empires had already come up with the concept of universities, and simply Catholics learned it from them during their, because they were actually taking cultural diffusion off of the Eastern Golden Age, right? Now, the thing about it that you also need to know, last thing but not least, to just wrap this whole thing up, is that the church power is going to grow very rapidly, and kind of a little too rapidly at that. So the church and popes began to accrue massive amounts of money very, very quickly, and especially during the High Middle Ages as trade begins to return, okay? So getting into it, this led to corruption and extreme concepts of punishment for people who refuse to pay tribute to the church, pay their tithe, or do what the Pope or priest asked them to do, right? Now remember, this is where we get into that kind of little shaky area again. Mr. Terry is not saying anything bad about the Catholic Church. Mr. Terry is saying, though, that there was some bad leaders at any given point, right? There were some bad popes. There were some bad priests. You cannot expect millions of people to all be good all at the same time. So some of these corrupt people came along, and they created things like punishments for people that didn't do what they were supposed to in the Catholic faith, right? For example, excommunication, right? Let's say hypothetically you broke the laws of the Catholic Church, refused sacraments, tried to talk heresy or speak out against the church. You would be what is known as excommunicated, which means to be kicked out of the church, and so you could not receive sacraments or a Christian burial, and the church believed that that was going to sentence you to a lifetime in hell, right? So then going forward, you have an interdiction, right? Now, this is a really, really big difference maker. Excommunication is to be kicked out of the church. An interdiction, on the other hand, is an excommunication for an entire town or village, usually used to punish a noble, right? So like if a noble wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing, a lot of times popes or priests or cardinals or bishops would pass what's known as an interdiction. And this would actually excommunicate an entire village, hopefully like trying to lead to a revolt. So as you can tell, popes and priests are becoming a little political, right? And the most extreme form of like actual punishment was this thing known as the Inquisition, which is a church court who tried and convicted suspected heretics or people that would speak out against the church. And we're going to wrap it up right there because we're already getting a little bit long in this flip and it's a lot of information that you just had to take in. But we're going to go ahead and wrap it up right there and we're going to send it off and we'll talk about the Inquisition and a couple of other things about how the church is becoming a very large political body when we get into class when I see y'all again. Y'all have a good one.